Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project with your host Mick Spears. We bring you thought-provoking guests and topics every week to challenge your thinking about leadership. Our aim is to help you become the leader that you wish you always had as we learn together and lead together. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by Dan Cumberland. Dan is a product strategist, but he also has a passion about helping entrepreneurs and leaders to love their lives and their businesses again, and to help them manage burnout. And burnout is going to be the key topic that we talk about today. Dan is also the founder of the Meaning Movement, which that name has already got me intrigued, and we will spend some time talking about what the Meaning Movement is all about. So today, big focus around burnout. Dan himself has been through burnout and come out the other end, and he's very passionate about helping leaders to manage burnout in themselves and in their teams. So Dan, without any further ado, please do introduce yourself. Give us a little bit more of your very rich background around, I'm going to call you a serial entrepreneur, multiple startups and SaaS platforms, etc. A little bit about your background and what led you to be with us today.
Perfect. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It just means so much to have the chance to chat, and to your listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Yeah, I'm a bit of a serial entrepreneur. About 10 or so years ago, after starting my career in different sphere, kind of came to terms with the fact that I just like starting things, and allowed myself really to embrace that and see where that takes me. And that the first iteration of that was the Meaning Movement, has been the Meaning Movement. It's been with me for quite a long time. So I'll start there, and then I'll get on to the other things. The Meaning Movement started as a project really focused on the existential questions of why do we exist, which, the closer versions of those questions are, what do I want to do with my life? What career should I pursue? How do I find meaning and satisfaction in my work? Over the last couple of years, it's pivoted a bit to really focus more on how can entrepreneurs build businesses that we can love for the long haul. So still the same kinds of questions about meaning and satisfaction, fulfillment, but really directed specifically toward the entrepreneur and toward how we're thinking about our business goals and our life goals and the overlap between the two. For our listeners, audio listeners, I'm drawing these circles in the air. Like I think of it like a Venn diagram, the business and the personal, and that overlap section. So that's really what the Meaning Movement is focused on. Of a podcast, I have an accelerator that I run around that. But when I started, I had no idea how to run a business. My background had been in ministry and gone to grad school around these kind of questions. Did a degree, interdisciplinary degree, theology and psychology. Still so far from business. So when it came to, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to start things, I didn't know how to grow a business, didn't know anything about starting an online business. So started looking around for opportunities, collaborating with other people, which led to opportunities, doors open that got me into software. A few years later, was brought on by a private equity firm to run a software company. That engagement started as a 18-month engagement, turned into a 3-year engagement. After that, I jumped in with a business partner that I met through that to start a sales agency for software companies, taking what we were doing there and applying it to other software companies, which then turned into that business partner and I launching our own projects. So we have Trust Scout and Video Snap at this time. Those are the two surviving. There's plenty of others that have come and gone that we've tried and iterated and failed. And that's one of the biggest takeaways through my whole journey. And that's why it's something I'm so passionate about with entrepreneurs, talking to entrepreneurs, is that this is such a hard road. And culturally, we are set up for failure by the mainstream narrative around entrepreneurship, which is to just hustle it out, to go all in, to, just put everything you've got into it, keep at it no matter what, never quit. When the reality is misdirected hustle will lead you to burnout. If you go all in, you might not have enough in the tank for if and when that project doesn't work. How are you going to have another chance at bat? And what was the third one I just named? Oh, quitting. Yeah. Like sometimes you just have to say, I've given this the best go. go and it's not going to work. And it's time to, put it to rest and pick up the next project. And that's the beginning of my, I guess, some of the soapboxes that I get on around entrepreneurs. But I'm just so passionate about this journey because the journey that's been so formational in my life. And I think that's what I love about entrepreneurship. It is really, and leadership. I think of entrepreneurship as a subcategory of leadership, but that it is a journey of identity and identity formation and becoming the next version of yourself. And so I feel like it's kind of like the human experience distilled down into one specific avenue. So there's a start.
Lots to unpack there, Dan, and thank you for that very rich introduction. I would like to start with the meaning movement, and we'll head towards the burnout stuff a little bit later. So what I heard there is that the meaning movement started a bit more personal. It was more about personal purpose. But then as you move into your entrepreneurial roles and in businesses, you start thinking about, well, businesses need purposes as well. And you need collective and group purpose. And one thing that we know for sure on this show is that there's things that people want in the workplace. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to feel like they matter. And mattering starts with purpose. So tell us more about, in the meaning movement, from an individual, we'll start with the individual first. From an individual point of view, what is your guidance about how people find purpose and meaning in what they do?
I love it. I think it's the same from an individual, whether they are an entrepreneur or an employee, or a leader, manager, all of that. And there's 4 different areas of work where you experience purpose, and it overlaps with what you just called out. They'll start with P because I used to be a pastor, so they have to alliterate. You find purpose and meaning from the people that you're doing work with, the people you're doing work for, the people that you're serving, the people that are managing you, and vice versa. Those relationships in and of themselves can be a very significant place of meaning, or in the opposite, if they're unhealthy and toxic, they can be, move you in the opposite direction. The second piece, so the people, the process is the day in, day out of doing the work, just the substance of the deliverable of whatever your role is. It's easy to think about a coder or developer, engineer, laying down, writing lines of code and just the art that goes into that, or a writer just who loves to write, who loves to work with words, etc. But it expands beyond that to all roles. Like the work in and of itself can be a place of purpose, place of fulfillment, place of meaning. Then you have the product. That's the end product of your job, of your work. And that could be the organization that you're a part of. It could be the team within your organization, your branch, whatever it might be. But knowing that you're contributing to something that's making the world a better place, that sense of mission, that sense of purpose. It doesn't have to be that you're at a huge, especially these big corporations, that you don't have to love that, the end product of what they're doing in the world, but maybe you can love the contribution that you're making to one specific endeavor, whatever it might be. And then that final one is the payoff or the profit, whichever word you want to put to that, which is paying the bills. It's the lifestyle that it gives you. It's the other ways that it benefits you. So across all 4 of those categories, you can then think about how it gives you a framework for thinking about any work endeavor that you're currently in. And quickly you can assess where are the gaps and where are the strengths in that endeavor. And what you'll find is that some roles will have really high rank, really high rating on one of those categories and be really low on the other. And sometimes if you're high enough, just, even just, with the people piece, maybe you just love the people that you work with. You don't love anything else about your job. And that in and of itself can make the job feel really meaningful. The best work would be, of course, like high marks all across the board, but those are really hard roles to find and usually take a lot of iteration and a ton of self-knowledge to really understand where you're happiest, where you find the most meaning. And I think some of the other couple quick outcomes of that is just the invitation that like that profit piece. I think that, when I first started in this realm, I was so frowned upon the idea that like work was just about money. And I think it was a little bit naive of me because since then, and even in my own life, especially as I've become a parent, I have 3 kids, I've come to understand just how meaningful it is just to provide a future for my family. And that in and of itself does make work a very meaningful endeavor, to know that you're providing for the people that you're committed to providing for. And the other piece I think is really interesting and helpful to name is that with that purpose piece, you can really also get into a lot of, or the product piece rather, of like the mission of the organization that you're a part of. Knowing that you're building something that matters in the world can really get you into a place of really, it's like emotional, intellectual dissonance where the environment is toxic. If you're underpaid, if you're don't love the work you're doing, but the product of that work, is doing good in the world. You see this a lot in nonprofits in particular because they're often under-resourced. It puts you in this space where you feel feel like you should love what you're doing because the end product of that is making the world a better place. But there's all these other things that are pulling, kind of sucking the life out of that for you. So it gives you hopefully a framework to name some of that and assess what might need to change in your work. So that's some of my, how I begin to think about these things.
I'm loving the balance of all of that, Dan. I want to share back with you what I'm taking away from it. And then you just correct me if I went on a bit of a tangent. So we've got people, process, product, and payoff or profit. And I'll unpack that in a moment. So, and to have a job that you really love, there needs to be a balance of all of those things, right? You do need to enjoy working with the people around you. You do need to feel like, and that includes your customers and your stakeholders, not just your co-workers. It includes your boss. It includes your team. Do you enjoy working with the people around you? Do you feel like you're serving them? Do you feel like they're serving you? And is it a harmonious environment, let's say? On the process, you've got to enjoy what you're doing. If you're getting what I call heavy leg syndrome, where you get to work every day and your legs get heavy and you don't want to climb the stairs because you're going, oh, here we go again, same old, you're not enjoying the process. So are you enjoying the process? The product, that's got why written all over it. So why do we do what we do? How does this product serve the world? How does it improve people's lives? And some questions that can help you with that one. What would happen if we stopped doing this? What would happen if we did more of this? And you can start seeing purpose emerge there. And then on the payoff, I've got a very similar view on this one to you, Dan, I think. So profit often is a dirty word. And I think Gordon Gekko's got a lot to blame for there. You know, greed is good and all this kind of stuff. But profit, let's face it, it puts a roof over your head and puts food on the table, but it also fuels the dream. It fuels the dream because if you're making money, you can invest that money back into the product so the product can get better, so the people can get rewarded. And I would say that, like, whenever I do an Ikigai exercise, Dan, I'll just put one more flavor on the payoff bit. I change the word, can I be paid for this, to can I be rewarded for this? Because reward is not just financial. It's also, do I get joy and fulfillment? Do I go home at the end of the day very proud of what I did that day, and I can go to my family and say, yeah, I did good today. I did something that was worthwhile. So I change payoff with reward, but that would break your alliteration of P's.
It's okay. I shouldn't be necessarily as committed to the P's, but I feel like that was a very well articulation of the framework. I think, one thing that you named that I think is really interesting and kind of bleeds over into this burnout piece, even just talking about like the nonprofits and like how the product piece can be really confusing. You talked about the why. And one thing that I've noticed in my own life, when I've been in places where I've been personally burned out, I find myself checking in with the why. Simon Sinek says to start with your why and know the why of why you're doing this. And I've found that what's the right word? The tempo or the regularity at which I find myself asking the question of why am I doing this is a symptom to me that something else might not be working. So if my other P's are off, I'm going to be calling out to whatever one is right to help me endure the heavy leg syndrome, like you're naming, in order to give myself that extra boost. And I'm all in favor. I think, know your why and have a good reason for showing up and doing the work you do, but you also have to pay attention to the how. And those two things have to go hand in hand. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough.
This is really interesting. I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. So Nietzsche is famous for a saying that says, and forgive me that it's gender specific, he comes from a different generation, obviously. He who has a why can outlast any how. And for him, that was about concentration camps. It was a very real thing, and a why got them through some horrible times. But what I'm hearing from you, Dan, is if you're in that situation where your powerful why is getting you through the day and getting you to be resilient against some pretty toxic how, and you're putting up with things that maybe you shouldn't put up with, that's a flag for you maybe to set some better boundaries and go, well, hang on a second. Yes, we have a powerful why, but if we work on our how, we'll all enjoy our work a little bit more. How does that sit with you?
That is 100% right. And I think that we over romanticize this idea of grit and resilience. I think that they're fantastic skills to have. When applied appropriately, they're incredible, but they shouldn't be, held up on a pedestal. Like if you're sticking it out just because you want to stick it out or you feel like you have to stick it out, that's not a good reason. And if there is a different way for you to go about chasing the big why that you have that would allow for more joy and more fulfillment, you'll be in a much better better place. And I think that in my own story of when I've encountered burnout in my own life, it came to me like a wake-up call where I looked up from my work and felt like I was in a place that I didn't recognize. The future in front of me looked so different than what I expected. But I've been so heads down, focused on chasing after these goals, these big whys that I was chasing after, that I realized I had been sacrificing my day in, day out in order to chase that why. So I was sacrificing my everyday to a life that I didn't love in order to achieve this future that then, and this is some of what the wake-up call was with me, a bunch of things happened, business failures, my grandmother passed away, another death close to me. All of these things just kind of like ripped my future from me, it felt like in some ways. And I was like, I was sacrificing everything to get to that future. And now it's gone. And the only thing that I have is the present. And yet I've looking at my, how I've been spending my time, the present life that I've been living isn't as fulfilling, as fun, as much joy, doesn't have as much joy as it could have if I was making different choices. And I think that when we have that why and it's so strong and we're so mission focused, we can so easily sacrifice too much in order to chase after it and try to bring it to reality.
Really powerful stuff, Dan. So the takeaway I'm taking here is to really think about that. And I agree with you on resilience. Sometimes resilience is overemphasized. People say, you just need to be more resilient. That doesn't help anyone to say something like that, right? So if you're in a situation so we get the behavior that we tolerate. And what I'm hearing here is if you're putting up with things, if you're, to use your word, Dan, if you're sacrificing things that are important to you, values and beliefs that are important to you because your why is important, what Dan is telling us is it doesn't have to be an or. It can be an and. So yes, go after that why because it's clearly driving you, and address the how, and don't put up with behavior and sacrifice things that are important to you. You can do both. So come back to the 4 Ps. Do you love the people that you're working with? Do you love the process? Do you love the product and what you're bringing to the world? And are you getting the payoff in any kind of reward in that? And you need to work on all 4, not just the purpose. I love it, Dan. I got one more question about meaning, and then I do want to unpack your experience with burnout for sure. What role did your background in theology play in your pursuit of meaning?
Oh, that is such a good question. Thank you for asking that. That means a lot. I don't know. I feel like so often these conversations don't go there because it's often not the space for it. My background in theology, I think that it maybe undergirds some of my assumptions about life, that there is some sense to be made out of our existence and out of our experience. And, personally, I believe that there is something more than just this life, and that everything that we're doing here and that we experience does make sense in some way. And so I think that it really kind of drives some of my curiosity around this. On a personal level, it also is a part of my own story of why of my why. It's a little bit meta. My why for doing this work around whys, around other people's whys. I thought for a long time that I was supposed to be in ministry, that God had called me to ministry, and it wasn't a good fit for me. And it took me a long time to really parse out that it wasn't God that told me to go into ministry, but it was my youth pastor when I was, an impressionable teenager. It was a great influence in my life in many ways, but I could have been seen better, I think, in that phase of life and guided a little bit more. And it took me a long time to, I think, parse out that where that voice, that desire, that urge to go into ministry came from. And it was a lot of pain along the way of trying to fit myself, felt like a square peg into a round hole, and which then called into question all of, when you feel like the ultimate being in the universe has told you to do something and it's not working, it's a pretty painful place to be. I felt like I was the problem, couldn't figure out how to make it work, since that was the only possible conclusion. It took years of therapy and, some really good coaches in my life asking some really directed questions for me to begin to parse that out. And so that bled into then some making sense of my experience, and then also making sense of, how do I think about God and who is God and is there a God? All of those questions, it felt like my whole worldview kind of crumbled, and I had to kind of go through this process of rebuilding, which is all to say some of what drives me to continue this work is that for me, these questions are, due to my personal experience, they are inextricably linked. The theology, I think, how we think of God, how we think about, the universe, how we think about reality has as much to say about us as it does to say about the world around us, that we're always viewing viewing things through our own lens. And that lens is something that it's been shaped by our experience. It's been shaped by the culture we've been a part of, the people that we've encountered, all of those things. And so for me, I guess I do in my work as much as possible, have this conversation without that conversation, because not everyone wants to have that conversation, but it feels like there's just such a thin line between the two. So I feel like that's kind of maybe a roundabout way of answering it, but it really speaks to some of my journey here.
It's really interesting, Dan, and I'm hearing three things there. I am hearing about the pursuit of meaning and asking questions about there must be a bigger meaning to why we exist and why we do what we do. The second thing I hear is someone sitting in front of me that had that experience of the why and how were not matching. So something wasn't sitting right. You thought you had a clear calling about where you needed to be, but it wasn't working. So you listened and you paid attention and you went, no, this is not working for me. And you evolved. And the third thing is that purpose can evolve. So even if you're lucky enough to have clarity of purpose at 20, which most people do not, by the way, but if you're lucky enough to have clarity of purpose at 20, by the time you're 30, that purpose might have evolved a little. By the time you're 40, it might have completely evolved. So I think purpose is not permanent. It is something that emerges and kind of dusts itself off and takes little turns left and right as you go along. How does that sit with you, Dan?
I think it's exactly right. And I think that where that takes me is two things. Is one, that I do think that purpose is subjective. And that's something that people who maybe have a capital T in their theology sometimes have a kind of makes their the hairs on the skin stand up a little bit. But like that, it's a very personal thing. What is meaningful to one person is not necessarily meaningful to someone else. And to some degree, we have to make it up ourselves, which isn't, I don't think that just the best way to answer the question of why am I here or what's meaningful for me is just choose something. There's better ways to go about, I think, answering that question. But then to your point about the evolution, that it does evolve. And I think that there's a couple reasons for that. And one of them is that we're always evolving. We are always changing. Therefore, our perception of ourselves and where ourselves meet the other, the world, the universe, all of that is ever evolving. So our sense of purpose should continue to evolve with us. The only caveat to that is, in my experience, like it does change, but I feel like it always rhymes. Like it's rarely a complete, 180 from, maybe what was a direction that you were, involved in early in your life. And then you move in a completely other direction. Maybe at some level it feels like that. But if you pull back the layers far enough, you begin to see that there's this theme or this rhyming that's happening where you're always trying to be a part of bringing about the same kind of goodness in the world, or preventing the same kind of pain and harm or, negative experiences in the world.
I'm going to give you two flavors there and two examples that I think prove your point. When I see your evolution, Dan, sitting in front of you, I'm not going to sit here and psychoanalyze you, don't worry. But when I see you start in the world of theology and starting with the pursuit of meaning of life around values and beliefs, around faith, etc. And what do you do now? You help entrepreneurs fall back in love with their jobs again, to find purpose around what they do, to surround themselves with people that they love, have a good process, have a good product, have a good payoff, etc. There is a theological element of that. The religion part might be completely agnostic now and removed, or the flavor of religion might be removed from that. But the pursuit of meaning, the values and beliefs, and all of those things pervade. That's what I see with you. So your purpose has pivoted, but the theme has not. For me, my two worlds, right? So I'm obsessed with the world of urban mobility, where I look to create a world where people can move freely around their cities without delays, without congestion, and ultimately without stress. So I spent a good chunk of my life trying to de-stress the way people commute to and from work. And then when you think about my other world, which is my obsession with leadership, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to create an environment where people fall back in love with their jobs again and to de-stress the workplace. So you could say I've got two purposes, but in reality, it's one purpose that turns up in two different ways. How does that sit with you?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That you could look at those two examples that you gave and say, these have nothing to do with each other, but you pull back the layers far enough and you begin to see those themes. There's this great little book, Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's all the subtitles, Listening for the Voice of Vocation or something like that. So Parker Palmer's I think he's a Quaker by training. So he's thinking, through a theological, framework, but the short book, like 150 pages or something like that, all about thinking about how you find meaning and purpose in your work and in your world, how that really emerges. And he talks about it in so many beautiful ways, like that he talks about like a wild animal that you encounter in the woods, and you get these fleeting glimpses of it and then it disappears from you. But he tells a story, and this is what I wanted to center on here, of his own life. And he's a teacher, he teaches and writer around, these ideas. But when he was younger, he wanted to build airplanes, and he would make these books and books of airplane designs. He would draw all of these airplanes and, the schematics and everything else, and he'd compile them all into all of these books. And it took him some time to realize that it wasn't the airplanes, but it was the books. And I just kind of circle back to, what you're saying. That's just another example of how, you could say, well, he was into airplanes, so how do you make sense of that? But then to him, it was about the books. It was about the compiling of this information and this knowledge all together, which is another just great example of that rhyming or that thematic piece to all of this conversation.
Wonderful illustration. And we do need to ask those questions. What is it about this thing that I love? And not just take the obvious answer. Look a bit deeper. Yeah, really good, Dan. All right, so we've danced around it a little bit up until now, and I'm dying to get into it. So you've had your own experience with burnout that you're now trying to share with the world, share with others the lessons that you've learned along the way. So let's get into it. Tell us about your own journey around burnout.
Yeah, I already, spoke to it to some degree. It was about just over a year ago now. It was this kind of perfect storm of a handful of things. It started with a marketing campaign for softwares that just fell apart on us. You had a really solid growth trajectory and kind of leveled off, and then just took a major nosedive. In conjunction with that, a business partner on that project decided to walk away and move on to another project. My grandmother passed away. My accountant passed away. All of these within like the span of a couple months. And as I've already kind of named a little bit of like this wake up moment of like, where am I? What am I doing? And in addition to all of that, it's just like this heaviness that I felt like I just didn't have anything in the tank to carry on and to pick the pieces back up. And that's when a friend of mine was the first to really call it out and just say, maybe you're experiencing some burnout. And I had I'd heard the word burnout before and was very resistant to actually like saying that's what I was experiencing. And I think that a big piece of that was like, I don't know, I also turned 40 last year, which I think of those as two separate things. Maybe they're not, but like also like I feel like I had like maybe this is a part of my own midlife crisis moment. Like these things, the capital B burnout, the capital M midlife crisis, I just expected them to feel different maybe than they felt for me. And so some of what I've just have been so passionate about in my journey and in my work is sharing some of that story, inviting people to think about burnout in a different way. That burnout at its core is your body and your soul telling you something that you were unwilling to admit up until that point. And I think that at all times we're experiencing some level of burnout. I think of burnout much like it's kind of like you can think of it like a jet, right? It's the jet engine that's burning, right? And you can go fast. You can turn your thrusters up all the way, and eventually you're going to run out of fuel. And that's when you feel the burnout, unless you're refilling that tank. And so in that, if you think about it in those terms, what we think about as capital B burnout is when we hit those limits, when we've overtaxed ourselves, when we've applied too much force, so much force that we're unable to recover from it in the time that we have allotted for it. And I think there's, hundreds of implications of that. And I think that it's in my own life. And as I looked around at the other entrepreneurs that I've seen hit these walls in our entrepreneurial journeys, I think it's one of the most costly mistakes that we make as entrepreneurs. I think also as leaders, the most expensive mistakes aren't the ones that have dollar signs on the choices, but have expensive implications. When you have your pacing is off, you're going too fast, too hard. And so then you're sacrificing relationships, you're sacrificing health, you're sacrificing the other P's that we've already talked about, right? To chase after the product or the big why that you're chasing. All of those things end up costing so much more than the business outcomes that we're so focused on and the mistakes that we could make in the business realm.
So there's three things that I picked up there, Dan, and I want to break them into two. I'm going to ask you about them in two. So I'll tell you what they are. The first two are awareness and stigma, and the third one was the bit about refilling the tank. But I want to start with awareness and stigma. So what I'm hearing from you here is that you didn't necessarily pick up the signs yourself. It was someone else that was able to look from outside the jar and look into the jar and go, you're running on fumes, pal, right? So you needed someone to be able to bring it to your attention. And then what I picked up there, Dan, and please never hesitate to correct me if you think I'm on a tangent, but I picked up a little bit of a resistance that no. And when I hear that, the word stigma come to my mind. So the two questions I've got there: how do you help someone to see when they're showing the signs of burnout, number one, and how do we overcome the stigma that I believe exists, that, if someone says, oh, sorry, I need a 3-month sabbatical, I'm burnt out, that there's a stigma of sticking up your hand and saying, sorry, everyone, I need help right now.
Love it. I'd like to answer them in reverse order. So I'll answer the second one first, the stigma piece. I totally agree. I think there is a lot of stigma about it. I think that was some of my resistance to it. I didn't want to have that label on myself. And I think a big part of it is just by naming it and talking about it. And just like we're doing right now, right? Like that listeners are hearing two men having a conversation about burnout, and hopefully that's giving them permission to have more conversations about burnout, to know that this is a normal thing. And I do think, again, this I think goes back to the theological questions, which to me is like all of this conversations for me kind of hang on to the hook of what does it mean to be human? And I think burnout is a very human experience. It's an emotional experience. And I think that should be normalized as something that happens to pretty much everyone. Everyone who's doing something that matters to them will likely at some point experience a sense of burnout because they're chasing after something that matters. So just under the category of stigma, I think that's just talking about it, having conversations about it, bringing it up, naming it in your own life. I think there's a huge opportunity for anyone in leadership and anyone in management to name it for themselves. Even if it's just like, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit burnt out this week. Like, it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the thing is like, I just shouldn't have a capital B at the start of burnout. It should just be a way we talk about the relationship, the ratio of workload to recovery. And I think that's, how we should talk about it. And then to go to your other question of how do we help other people identify it? For me, the friend who called it out, his name is Raj Lula. He runs a marketing agency in Omaha, branding and marketing. Great team. He's fantastic. You should look him up if anyone needs marketing services. A little shout out to Raj. And he was reading something that I had written on the meaning movement. He was kind of in my world a little bit, had been a guest on the podcast. And then he just reached out to me. It's like, hey, you sound a little burnt out. And it really for him came like the reason I think he picked up on it was because he had been through something similar. And so he just had a little bit more sense for it and kind of read between the lines of what I was writing about, what I was saying. And so I do think for those of us who have had these kinds of experience, it raises our awareness, our sensitivity to be able to call out and hopefully invite people to listen to themselves in those ways. But I do think there's some other questions that you can ask. And I think of these as kind of like diagnostic questions. And so especially people in leadership, especially managers, I would love for managers to take some of these questions to heart, to like in their one-on-ones and in their, as they're doing, their annual reviews or whatever, however they're in their meetings, thinking, helping their people, the people that you're leading, think about their day-to-day and improve their well-being. The first question is, if you had to live your last 90 days on repeat, how happy would you be? I think it's a really interesting question because 90 days is long enough that like hard things can happen in life, but you've had probably a little bit of time to bounce back and you have enough control in that time period to really be making choices about how you're living your life. So then to think of like, okay, I have to do this on repeat Groundhog Day for a 90-day period, I think is really revealing about the pace that we're living, the things that we're doing and how we're, recovering from our workload. And another important question that's somewhat similar is thinking about the people that are closest to you. Maybe it's a partner, spouse, maybe it's a close friend. If someone asked them how happy you are, what would they say? Or would they say that you are happy? And I asked my wife that as I was kind of workshopping some of these, what are the diagnostic questions we could use? And I just asked her, I was like, what would you say if someone asked you if I was happy? And she's like, I hope no one ever asks me that. She kind of laughed about it. I was like, well, that's kind of a red flag, right? That's a red flag for me. And so I challenge anyone here to ask their spouses, partners, close friends, ask them that question, see where that takes you. Those are a few questions to begin with.
Let me share again what I'm taking away here. So first thing is that on this show, we talk a lot about 3 dimensions of leadership, Dan. The first one is leading self. Second one is leading others. And the third one is leading the business, right? And this is making sure your business is healthy and we cash flow positive and all of those things, right? So what I'm hearing here is as a leader, you've got a responsibility. Yes, you need to lead self, and you might even have to look in a mirror and ask yourself some of these questions that Dan is asking. And then as a leader leader of leading others to stay curious, to be observant and ask better questions and stay curious about the answers. Create a psychological safe environment, by the way, where people feel like they can be honest in their answers. But what I'm hearing here is ask better questions, stay curious. How does that sit with you?
I think that that's exactly true. And I think like what you named just about the psychological safety is so essential. And I'm just so hungry for leaders to take seriously the space that they create. And that's why I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing with this show and everyone who's listening, who's thinking intentionally about how they lead, that it's not just about the business outcomes that you're chasing after. But again, and maybe this goes back to me, starting my career as a pastor, like I that's my framework for everything in life is like, how do we care for the people? How do we care for the people that we're leading? How can you pastor the people that are under your leadership? How can, and using, the word pastor, like comes from like shepherding, like the analogy of a shepherd in the field caring for the sheep, right? How can you be caring for the people that you're in leadership over in more than just making sure that they're achieving the business outcomes, but that they are achieving the personal outcomes that they're chasing after in life, that they're, living their best life, the best life possible in the circumstances that they're in the work environment that they're in, with the team that they're on. You have so much power to help them level up in all of those ways. And so I just want to offer that challenge to folks to really view themselves and their leadership as a tool to really increase the awareness of the people that they're leading in all of these ways and increase their joy and happiness in their day-to-day lives.
So it is power and responsibility. That's what that comes down to. And the word responsibility, to unpack that further, to remember you're responsible for the place where people are spending up to 1/3 of their life. You're responsible for the place where they're spending up to 1/3 of their life. So you've got to create the environment where they can feel safe, where they can do their very, very best work, where they can show up as themselves and be themselves and bring their superpowers to the table. And to use your pastoral element, you are then the pastor of that environment where they're working. You're creating that environment through your behaviors, through your role modeling, through the way you celebrate and reward positive behaviors, the way that you tolerate or don't tolerate toxic behaviors. You're responsible for creating that environment. I want to add this word observant. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. What, beyond just the questions you were talking, which were wonderful, what are the other signs that leaders can look for?
That is such a good question. There's my mind goes to a lot of soft things, hard things, but I think that being observant is really the key here. I would look at changes in behavior, changes in emotional regulation. People are responding in ways where it feels like, because this is really the measure, it's a lack of emotional reserves. Like that's what burnout, another way to define burnout. And so if they're quicker to anger than they typically are, if they're quicker to other feelings, frustration, sadness, just being short with coworkers, if they're slower to raise their hand to say yes to new responsibilities, I think that like it really takes this observing of who they are and how they're responding in the moment or moments, and then juxtapositioning that to what you know of them historically. And is there a change in behavior that then you could just ponder and inquire about? And I think that's the other piece I'd add to that. I think it's observation and then curiosity. And curiosity just to say, how's it going? And it might be like they have other things in life, right? Like it might not be burnout from work, but it might be because they have a kid who's, chronically ill, or, a parent that they're having to care for, like all the other things in life that are pushing them to that place where they don't have the reserves that they need to perform at their best.
Really good, Dan. So what I'm hearing there, Dan, is about observing baseline behavior, getting to know your team. What are they normally like? And the more that you're attuned to that, the more you'll be able to pick up the changes. So if someone is normally very calm, very reserved, and all of a sudden they're erratic and they're lashing out at people, that's a sign. And the opposite is true. If someone's very vocal and usually very passionate in meetings and the first one to speak up about topic X, and all of a sudden they're quiet and reserved and saying nothing, that's a sign. And get curious and go and find out what's going on. How does that sit with you, Dan?
That's exactly right. I think, yeah, being attuned, to how they normally are. I think it's a really great word for it.
Yeah, really good. All right. Now, the third one was about refilling the tank. Something I've taken away already from this, I want to run past you. You were talking about having those conversations with Raj, and by discussing it, you're already starting to get somewhere, and you use the word capital B burnout. So if we're not discussing it, if we're not having little releases along the way, we let it get to capital B burnout where there's no fuel left in the tank whatsoever, versus picking up the signs earlier and having open conversations. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, I think that you're exactly right. And I think that's why the capital B burnout, when I think of burnout, I think of like, you're just so spent, you just have to go stare at the wall for like 3 months and just, in like a vegetative state, like, because you're just so beyond, recovery. And I know that Greg McKeown in his books, he has 2 books, Effortless, and I forget the name of his other one. He talks about, especially in Effortless, this idea of never exerting yourself more than you have the time and capacity to recover from. And I think that that's a really great framework for thinking about whatever you say yes to in life and how many things you say yes to in life. It was easy for me in college to pull all-nighters because I was in college and could bounce back from an all-nighter and not have it have a major impact on my life. But now, at my age, with all the things that I have and all my responsibilities, I'm not going to say yes to pulling an all-nighter to hit some deadline, at least not very often, because I know that the cascade of effects that it would have and how long that would take me to recover. And I use that as an extreme example of how we approach all of our work. We don't have to get to these capital B burnout moments. And if hopefully for most people, you don't have to get there, but instead, and I think that's why I want to have conversations like this about this topic, inviting people to have these check-ins sooner than later in order to course correct your entrepreneurial journey and to think about, am I going at a sustainable pace? And part of that is, what are you chasing after? And do you have a measure in mind for when you can say that that's complete? And I think that's, again, why I feel like this is so relevant to entrepreneurs, because we have these big goals of, I'm just going to push hard until my business hits X figures or whatever it might be. And then we sacrifice everything to chase after those. And then we never hit those, at least not in a realistic timeline. And so then we give up so much life and end up burnt out in the chase, chasing after those big audacious goals. And so the invitation here is to have these check-ins, have multiple metrics for success, not just achieving your goals, not just achieving your work responsibilities, but to have other success metrics for how you measure, what success looks like in your life.
I do want to come back to the entrepreneur one in a moment, because I do see that one a lot in friends of mine, et cetera, et cetera. I've probably experienced a bit of that myself at different times as well. The bit about the management, proactive, constant management, monitoring, managing yourself and others is what I'm hearing here, Dan. And I want to put out the metaphor and an analogy of an Olympic athlete. So Olympic athletes do not train every day of the week for 4 years at 100% capacity. They're very deliberate about their rest and recovery. Some days they'll train at 70% performance, others they will be at race pace, that they are very deliberately ramping up, ramping down, ramping up, resting completely, etc., etc. And yet in the business world, we can get driven into cultures where the almost expectation, and I want to unpack this expectation word a little bit more in a moment as well, but there's almost this expectation to work 12 to 16 hours a day at 100% capacity. And it's not realistic. It's not realistic. Tell me your thoughts about this management and gradations.
I'm so happy that you brought up the athlete metaphor. I think that athletics is such a good metaphor for so much of life, but especially the fastest way from whatever your fitness level is to setting your next personal best record is not 100% all the time, just like you're naming. It is structured effort and structured recovery. And anyone who's pursued athletics in a aggressive way, that like you can so easily go too hard and end up hurting yourself. I'm a big runner. I have, a Garmin running watch that tells me when I've been going too hard and I need to take it easy, because I need a watch to actually give me that same kind of feedback, the kind of feedback that we're talking about, bringing awareness to these things. And so what I think the invitation here is to reframe recovery or rest or play or time off, not as and this is how so often I'm so guilty of this, viewing it as like just this necessary thing that you just have to do because it's life. You have to sleep and it's an unfortunate inherent part of the human condition. But instead of it being like just something that you have to do that keeps you from being productive, it's actually accelerating and adding to the productivity. And so the fastest way from here to achieving your goal is not to just hustle your way all the way through, but to hustle and then rest and recover, hustle and then rest and recover. And you'll get much further, much faster if you take that approach.
Yeah, I'll give an example. Now let's go into the entrepreneur thing and then we'll come back to the expectation element. So this is where I do see entrepreneurs, and I'll stick up my own hand here and give an example of where I've been guilty of this, right? So as an author, you could be sitting around on a Sunday morning and the best thing for you right now could be some rest. It might be to go for a walk or whatever. But the entrepreneur who's trying to drive some kind of purpose-driven business and really wants to be successful, I can tell you, it will often get the thought in my mind of, oh, what could I be doing right now that would be helping the business instead of resting and recovering? So for me as an author, instead of relaxing on Sunday morning, the thought pops into my head, I could write another chapter right now. So how do we battle those demons?
Oh, that is so good. I think this is like, you're hitting so close to home because my wife and I both are so wired for productivity and getting things done. And like the best weekend at home starts with a nice long to-do list, you know? And so you're speaking my language in that, like, it's hard. It's hard for someone like me to take that approach. But I think it comes back to this idea that by not forcing yourself, trying to dig into those emotional reserves to pull out the laptop and pound out a chapter, by not doing that, then that chapter, when you do write it, is going to be so much better because you'll be in the right mental space for it. And I feel like, especially with writing in particular, right, or anything that takes like that emotion and that creativity, it feels like even easier to kind of to point at, but it goes beyond that. If it's not about the quality of the work in that moment, it's about the longevity of you staying in a healthy place and doing the work. The more you force yourself, the more you have to grit your teeth and just bear it, the more that's going to catch up with you and the more that you're going to have negative consequences down the road.
These are great reminders that I hope all the entrepreneurs out there listening do remind yourself of these things. Those little breaks will give you longevity and you'll do better work. When you open up that laptop tomorrow morning, you'll do better work than if you open it up at 11 p.m. tonight, right? As an example. All right, very good. Let's go back to the corporate world now and talk about expectations. So I think most people listening to this show that have worked in any kind of multinational company or larger enterprise, you've probably come across this creature before. And that is around role modeled behaviors where senior executives are the ones whose car is in the car park first thing in the morning and the last one to leave. They are working 16 hours a day. And whether they tell other people or not that is what they expect. And quite often they don't, by the way. They do not expect everyone else to match it, most of them. The unwritten expectation is people start looking at that behavior and go, oh, if I want to be the CEO one day, I've got to do that. How do we manage either stated or unstated expectations around managing our levels of burnout?
It is so, so good. The first thing I would say, especially if you are in a situation where you have a manager who's works long hours, is to get clarity from them. So from the person that's leading you, one way to lead yourself and lead up is to just articulate it. I notice that you're sending emails all day, every day of the week at all hours of the night. I don't work like that and prefer to have a work-life balance. And I want to have your permission to know that that's okay. And if not okay, then we'll need to have chats about what that looks like. But I think just to articulate that, state it, bring it out into the open and name it so that it doesn't remain an unspoken expectation. I think the more you can bring it out into the open and talk about it, the better. And then I think on the leadership side, I think a lot of, this is both, I think, for leading yourself as well as leading the people that you manage, is to, one, think about how is your pace and do you want the people in your life to be following a similar pace to you? If the answer to that is no, and sometimes it's easier to say that, like that, you don't want the people that you're managing to be working as much as you're working or the hours that you're working, then probably you shouldn't be doing that. That'd be the first place to go with that. But if you're in a situation, maybe the CEO of a company or, high level VP or whatever, and you just have more work than the job can handle during the season or whatever, I know that there's really demanding jobs out there. You don't always have control over that. I'm a big fan of stating it to the people that that you manage, saying, I don't expect you to check your emails over the weekend or whatever it might be. And then also, I'm also a big fan of scheduling things. If you're working during the wrong hours, this happens a lot with kids. They're up in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. You can't sleep. Sometimes that happens to me. My mind's going. So then I go and do a little bit of work at 3 a.m. I schedule those emails to be sent during working hours. I schedule my Slack messages to be sent during working hours. So then over the weekend, if I'm doing a little bit of work, I try not to, make it known that I'm doing that kind of work so that the people that I manage don't feel like they should be doing that kind of work as well. But that's the edge case. And I hope that, the takeaway for folks would rather be like, the first is try to make some changes and be more controlled on that.
All right. So the three things I'm taking away there is turn implicit expectations into explicit expectations. So have the conversation and make it clear to people. The second one is role model the behavior that you want to see in your team. So if you are exhibiting these behaviors and you don't need to, back it off a bit. And the third one is there are seasons where you might need to be in a sprint or whatever the case may be. And there might be some times where you are writing emails on a Sunday night or whatever. But as Dan is saying, most email applications allow you to just delay the sending and get it sent on 8 a.m. Monday morning or whatever the right time is for your team. So 3 pretty good takeaways there. One more theme, Dan, and then we're going to get into our rapid round. And that now it's the management. And I'm talking about the leader who has someone in their team who is clearly showing the signs of burnout. What do we do now?
Oh man, this is such a good question. The first thing that I recommend people do is just to have a conversation and to name it. And hopefully they'll be receptive to it and recognize that they are, indeed experiencing those levels of burnout. Hopefully you're in a position where you can put a plan together for them to help name some of those things. As we've already talked about, not always just work things. It also might be life things. And so to think together with those team members, how can we support you? How can we support you in this season when you're, caring for a family member or whatever? All the other stressors in life might be adding up to too much. How can we support you and help you get to a better, healthier, balance in your work? If they're not receptive to it, I think that's when it can become challenging because eventually it will bleed out into culture. It'll bleed out into, relationships. And that, I don't honestly have a great pathway for that other than I think it would eventually need to be handled just as any kind of poor performance ultimately would need to be handled. If they can't get the help when you try to help them, if they aren't receptive to correction, then ultimately they might not be the right fit in the organization.
That's an interesting one. So it definitely starts with having the right conversations and staying curious and asking the right questions and trying to support them. So that's what I'm hearing. I have seen exactly what you're talking about with the word non-receptive is interesting because quite often they might be very receptive to the feedback. Oh, yeah, I'm going to manage it. But then you turn around and you find that their own worst enemy sometimes. They're bringing it on themselves, right? So they've just had a meeting with you about managing their workload and delegating more or whatever the case may be. And you turn around next week and they're writing a plan that they didn't have to write. It could have been delegated to someone else. It could have been shared to another team member, etc. But they decide themselves without any pressure whatsoever that they open up the laptop and they write that plan that they didn't necessarily have to. So, and then that I get your point. Then we start saying, hey, no, this is not sustainable. You maybe ramp up the dial on that conversation where it's more about their performance now rather than just about care and, hey, I was worried about you burning out, but now I'm worried about your behaviors. All right, really interesting, Dan. I've absolutely adored this conversation. I want to bring us to a close now with our rapid round. So these are the same 4 questions that we ask all of our guests. So the first one, what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
This is a hard one, but it is the journey ahead to building a business, to being an entrepreneur is going to be so much harder and take so much longer than you want it to. And I think that that's the dose of reality that I would love to give my optimistic 20-something self, or overly optimistic 20-something self. And I think, but also I would say start now.
All right, so it's going to take longer, but the first step starts now. Okay, well done, Dan. I love it. What's your favorite book?
I have so many books. I'm an avid reader, but the one that has really impacted me the most in recent years is Thinking in Bets by Annie Dukes, Annie Dukes is a former poker player turned business author. And she has that book as well as a book about quitting, which has also influenced some of what we talked about here today. In Thinking in Bets, she talks about how all choices in business are ultimately about risk and taking risks. And I mean, to put the whole book in a sentence, it's that the quality of a decision cannot be measured by the quality of the outcome, meaning that if there's always risk at play, and sometimes you end up on the positive side of that risk, and sometimes you make a really smart decision and it goes poorly. So you can't say that it was a bad decision just because the outcome was bad. And that's really helped me reframe a lot of things that have happened in my life, especially when things go sideways and you don't know how to process it, to find a lot more grace for yourself in the midst of that.
Yeah, really good, Dan. All right. What's your favorite quote?
My favorite quote recently is from a poem by David White. I'll put it in context. He's a fascinating poet. He writes some about work and has a book called The Crossing the Unknown Sea, which is, the subtitle says it all, Work as a Pilgrimage of Identity, which is just such a beautiful way to think about all the things that we're talking about here today. But he has this poem called Sweet Darkness. When your eyes are tired, the world is also tired. When your vision has gone, no part of the world can find you. Time to go into the dark, where the night has eyes to recognize its own. There you can be sure you are not beyond love. The dark will be your home tonight. The night will give you a horizon further than you can see. You must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. Give up all the other worlds except the one to which you belong. Sometimes it takes darkness and the sweet confinement of your aloneness to learn. Anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you.
Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, I'm going to listen back to that a few times and I think I'll get more takeaways from that as I do. But yeah, really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Dan. It's very good and it speaks volumes to what we've been discussing in today's interview. That's wonderful, Dan. Thank you so much. And finally, I'm sure, just like me, people have learnt a lot from this discussion today. How do people find you if they'd like to know more?
Well, first, this has just been such a fun conversation and would love to connect with anyone who this resonates with. I write a lot about these things on LinkedIn, so you can follow me on LinkedIn. I also have a podcast called The Meaning Movement that's on hiatus right now, planning to bring it back at some point. And themeaningmovement.com is my site where I talk about all these things and try to help people find more fulfillment, more purpose in our work, help entrepreneurs build businesses we can love for the long haul. So those are the places you can find me. I would love to connect.
Thank you so much, Dan Cumberland. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I feel richer from this conversation, and I'm sure the audience will as well. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.